will take us through the key findings with Kayleen O'Brien, who's here with me in Melbourne. She's a partner in Deloitte Consulting technology area as well, and very instrumental in women in IT and really trying to get more women to go into a career in IT. Now, there's somebody on the line who could they please mute their phone because we can hear some background noise.
No problem.
Thank you very much. And we'll go through the presentation, then there'll be plenty of time for questions as well. So, Robert, we'll get you to kick off now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those of you who've been along to our previous trends. This is the 6th edition of the Deloitte Technology Trends, and what I want to launch today is the Australian edition, which brings together our global view that our colleagues around the world have of technology trends, but then applies a Australian flavour of what we're seeing happening, and also adds in case studies. We have, in the Australian edition, we've brought together organisations like the City of Melbourne, Geelong Football Club, Victorian Comprehensive Cancer Centre, New South Wales Police, plus perspectives from a range of eminent practitioners in the industry in Australia as well. Two things I think it's worth just highlighting right up front in this year's report. First of all, this is the first time in 6 or 7 years that we've seen the balance switch from consumer technology to enterprise technology. And that's a really important shift. So in the 4 decades of technology, of IT developments, as it's really impacted business, the vast majority of that time, IT innovation has come out of the enterprise. And then there's been a trickle-down effect to the consumer. So think about in the 1970s, the rise of the microcomputer, which was really a hobbyist tool, a hobbyist toy that came from throwaway of enterprise technology. Through the 1980s, the PC really spun out of technology that had been built for the enterprise, and then was made into a consumer grades goods that gradually got picked up at the consumer level. But all of that changed in the noughties with mobile technology. And we've become very used over the last half decade to have these technology trends and say, look at this thing that's happening that's being delivered by the consumer companies and that consumers are getting used to using, and we can expect to see this come into the workplace. Well, this year we've reverted back to the status quo. Technologies, so drones, 3D printing, are turning out not to be technologies that are favoured by the consumer and then businesses picking up, but rather they're actually turning out to have a natural home in the enterprise first, and then we're seeing a dedicated core of enthusiasts who are picking up the offcuts from the development of that technology and using them as hobbyists. So let me launch into that, and that might become a bit clearer as we work our way through. For those of you listening in on the phone, I'm going to run through the presentation. We'll start with the slide that is the list of the 8 trends that we focus on this year, titled this year's top 8 tech trends.
Actually, sorry, can I just ask whoever's on the phone, can you just mute, because we can hear everything, all the rumbling.
No problem, we'll do.
Sorry.
Thank you. So the 8 we're going to go through are the role of a Chief Information Officer, which is changing again. The concept of the API economy, which is the development of new business models. Not new technology models, but new business models. Ambient computing, which is the evolution of the Internet of Things. Dimensional marketing, which is the bringing together of the different aspects of marketing and customer engagement. Software-defined everything, which is the continued virtualization of our networks. The core renaissance, which we've talked about in a number of our trends, that the ERPs, the big core systems that organisations have invested in, are not going away, but their role is changing and evolving. Amplified intelligence, which is the maturing role of cognitive analytics, perhaps more popularly called artificial intelligence, which is becoming a really important tool. And the IT worker of the future, those skills, where are we going to find the people that are actually able to do this for us? Jane, if I can go forward. Let's start with the CIO. The Chief Information Officer is feeling pretty threatened right at the moment. There are a whole range of new C titles floating around. Everybody's calling themselves a chief. Chief Marketing Officer, Chief Customer Officer, Chief Digital Officer. You're seeing everybody is trying to claim a chief space, and they've all got a technology angle to what they do. What we're saying to Chief Information Officers is that your role is one of integration. We actually have to, it's not about just being the owner of all technology, it's about bringing that technology together and not worrying about the fact that the Chief Digital Officer or marketing are building their own technology, and we have business units who have taken responsibility for their own technology through cloud and being able to provision services really quickly. But you actually need the CIO to be integrating it and taking an enterprise-wide view. We might have seen the CIO of years gone by having to manage really big budgets and deliver projects on time and to that budget. Now what we're seeing is actually they're managing smaller budgets and smaller teams, but they have a far more strategic role. By the way, they can look to their CFO counterparts for that story. CFOs of the 1960s and the 1970s had huge clerical teams who were responsible for executing the clerical finance functions of the business. Roll forward to today, and CFOs, much of that has been automated and distributed out across the business, but the CFO today has a much more strategic role. Next page, Jane. So, if we jump to key considerations, CIO, we're calling out the CIO needs to have line of sight to what's happening rather than line of control. They need to be very, very clear on what it is that sits at their core. So what are their core responsibilities? And they need to look after those. They need to be teamers. They need to bring together a team. They don't need, rather than to drive individual projects. So it looks a lot more like an ecosystem. Technology can't be promised and then delivered. Technology has to be prototyped and experienced. Experience is everything. Innovation is not a hobby, and what we're finding is one of the reasons that we talk about the trend towards outsourcing reversing and people bringing IT skills in-house is that it turns out that many of your most innovative people are actually technologists. So CIO has a lead role in innovation, and we're going to talk shortly about talent. So let me jump now to the API economy. Application programming interfaces is a technical term that the industry came up with when we realized that we were building really complex systems and that the reach of those systems could be extended by opening them up and allowing other programmers to access the same systems and to do things on top of them. Well, guess what? As more and more of our businesses have more and more of our intellectual property tied up in their technology assets, what they're finding is if they expose those assets, they can find third parties who they can team with, who will actually develop innovative business models of their own. So we're seeing companies around the world trying to open their businesses up. So rather than keeping their data and their intellectual property closed, they can actually make it an ecosystem. That ecosystem I was just talking about, and this is why the CIO's role in ecosystem is so important. Jump over to key considerations for this. The API name actually needs to be different for every single organisation because it's about inspiring business partners. Netflix, for instance, we talk about as a case study, needed to find language that was going to encourage third parties to become partners of Netflix. Amazon, similarly with Marketplace, needed to find partners who would want to join with them and use their technology platform and their proprietary assets, their privileged assets, as something that would enhance their business and both businesses benefit. I've called out in previous tech trend reports that Australia has been a good innovator in this space. In our mining sector, we've actually been quite good at getting multiple players together, join their balance sheets and specialise in key domains and use technology to enable them to partner more effectively. That's been particularly enabled by cloud. What we're calling out now is the next generation in 2015 needs to find its way through, where more of our consumer companies are going to need to open up their APIs and are going to need to encourage business partners to build on them. That's the only way that you can actually compete at volume as business becomes more complex. There is an element here of chicken and egg. You have to build it so they will come, but you also have to experiment and encourage them. Let me jump now to ambient computing. We've been talking about the Internet of Things for some time. It's absolutely matured. This is a domain that Australia has taken a lead role in. We have so much heavy industry, such an engineering focus to much of our business, that it was natural that we would put sensors on everything. Now what we're doing is we're realising that we actually need to make use of those sensors. The first half, in 2014, the focus was on collecting the data, using analytics to apply that data in innovative ways. In 2015, it's actually flicking to turning those sensors into switches and actually getting things to automate, making things happen as a consequence of the data without necessarily needing to intervene. You are seeing that in the consumer space, and business in 2014 picked up a fair amount of that. So some of the consumer automation in the home, with products that turn light switches on and off, with products that enabled remote monitoring, found its way into business. But business has now gone way beyond that with technology on the mine site, with technology on the construction site, with technology across the telco networks that is actually collecting data and able to intervene before something happens. In 2015, we're going to have to develop trust in this technology in order to let it run somewhat more without human intervention, which leads us to the key considerations. The ecosystem, if I can jump over the page, Jane. The ecosystem of sensors naturally comes from a range of different vendors. There's a temptation for them to fragment. The vendors are also realising that there's value in the data and they don't necessarily want to open themselves up. So on one hand we talk about the API economy, on the other hand there is still business value sometimes in being closed. So our organisations in Australia are going to need to walk that line, but organisations need to avoid fragmentation. It needs to be done through the eyes of the outcome, the eyes of the user, so the experience. Ambient computing has the capability of becoming creepy. You can imagine walking into a retail store and finding that every aspect of your experience in the store anticipates what you're going to do next. The coffee that you're going to buy, the clothing that you're most naturally going to look at, even with targeted advertising. There's a point where that becomes creepy, as we saw on Tom Cruise on the Minority Report a number of years ago.
They'll just start sending stuff to your home, won't they? And they'll just bill you on the credit card. You don't have to go in anymore.
I think, well, that's exactly right. And the question there, having things just sent to your home, anticipating your need, could be very convenient. And we're seeing the rise, the rise in the consumer space of products that you would have tended to go into a store to buy that are just being replenished consistently. Razor blades are becoming a big thing this year, but at a point where you're actually anticipating, not anticipating how many razor blades you're using, but actually you've got sensors on your razor blade that tells how many razor blades you've used. That's probably getting to the point of being creepy. Standards have not developed, and there's going to be a focus in 2015 on a balance between formal standards in this space and commercial pressure. Our bet in the report is that commercial pressure will win over standards, but government will step in and industry bodies will step in for a level of standards. Let me jump to dimensional marketing now. I mentioned before the rise of the chiefs. One of the chiefs is the Chief Marketing Officer trying to work with the Chief Digital Officer. Reason why these roles have risen is that organisations are realising that marketing is more complex than before. We've talked about omni-channel for some time now. Really, we're bringing together customer engagement, connectivity, data and insight. And it's just the right level of all of these to keep the end user in control, but while also anticipating needs. The sorts of things that people are trying to do with this is to work out what's the new way that customers are engaging in the network. So customers are engaging through physical stores, bricks and mortar. Customers are engaging online. Customers are still picking up the traditional phone, and they're expecting product to visit them in the home. What we are also seeing in 2015 is that these things that have been pioneered in the consumer space are actually happening in the business-to-business space. So the experience that the consumer expected when interacting with consumer companies, again, be they utilities, financial services, retail, are actually happening now when business is dealing with other business. So anticipating the needs, making the approvals easier. One of the things that we look at in technology trends is the obstacles to doing business between enterprises. We see that with when two businesses want to deal with each other, the primary obstacle, once you get past the desire to do the deal, is actually getting the internal approvals, is actually dealing with the bureaucracy. In the past, two companies tended to deal with each other as closed shops. The approval process, if you're trying to provision travel services, or if you're trying to provision telecommunication services, was actually done as to a single procurement officer, and then internal approvals ran behind the scenes, and then people drew down on the service. Today, there are agreements, there are envelopes being created between these organisations, agreements on what the nature of the relationship will be, actually what the return on investment for both companies will be, and then they're using these technologies to understand what the engagement is on both sides. Then through that engagement, enabling automatic approval and automatic provisioning. So we're actually taking the friction out of business. There is a phenomenal business productivity benefit to be gained if we get this dimensional marketing piece right in business-to-business space. So if we think about some of the things that we need to be aware of, it needs to be led by the user. It needs to be led by what the customer wants, regardless of whether that customer is a consumer or whether that customer is internal. It needs to be driven by the data. We've talked for years now in the tech trends about data. It cannot be channel-based. It has to be based upon the holistic interaction. And by holistic, I'm including that piece around the outcomes that both players in the transaction want to achieve. And I've only just touched on, the report spends more time on social. That one of the best channels for us to actually get this data is social, but it needs to be a two-way street. It can't just be about monitoring, it needs to be about all the activity. And social is as much a business tool as it is a consumer tool, and we have more and more social tools, business social tools appearing, which allow us to work out who works with who and what tools they're using in the workplace, enabling those organisations that are providing those services to better service their business customers. The next trend is software-defined everything. This is one of those trends that was like the IPv6 that we talked about previously in a previous reports. It sits a little bit behind. It's perhaps not as much of a headline item because it's enabling all of the other trends that we have. But software-defined everything is enabling us to scale up the technology, particularly for ambient computing, to levels that is going to avoid some of the bottlenecks that we'd otherwise experience. Here are some of the problems. Moore's law only applies to processing power. To a certain extent, we've been lucky enough that that storage has tracked pretty much along with it. Network capacity doesn't track along either with storage or processing power. So our networks have become complex and have only got so much bandwidth. Even though we see bandwidth going up dramatically. They don't follow anything like the exponential path of Moore's law, and they have a certain natural limit. That natural limit is the speed of light. Now that sounds like a big number, except that when you consider that we are asking people to move to cloud computing, where the service that they've been provided might be in one country, and the user might be in another country, and the speed of light between those still means I have got hundreds of milliseconds, certainly tens and maybe hundreds of milliseconds of delay that no amount of technology will allow me to get past. And that doesn't sound like much until things go backwards and forwards a number of times, and tens of and hundreds of milliseconds quickly becomes seconds. And I can no longer get past that barrier. What we're finding, the way that network providers are getting past this is they're doing more caching. They're moving more of the data you want and more of the processing that you want closer to you more quickly. There's a reason why the videos that you look at on the internet sometimes seem to go really fast and then another one goes really slow. It's because your service provider has been clever enough to cache some of it because other people have used those, have looked at those videos. Taking that further, we're going to see that caching get a lot smarter, and we're going to see network providers wanting to rapidly move processing and storage around to get it closer to the user and not to be constrained by the physical infrastructures that they're dealing with. So this is going to be really important in 2015. It's going to be really important to leverage the bandwidth that Australia is investing in right across the board for both for business and consumer. Considerations. If I move across, Jane, key considerations, how it's financed actually matters. So we've seen in Australia debates about financing of networks, financing of the infrastructure is also extremely important. This is not as simple as simply lifting up our traditional infrastructure and moving across to software-defined environments. We actually need application designers to design applications that naturally distribute themselves and are able to be provisioned cleverly in this way. And it makes the data center more of a commodity if we're successful through 2015 and 2016 in its application. Number 6, the core renaissance. Jane, if I can move forward one slide. We talked in a previous trends report about the end of the ERP. That is, people have predicted the demise of the ERP. It's not going anywhere. People are modernising their core systems. In Australia, we've seen a lot of press about big organisations making investments in their core systems, and we're seeing analysts of companies actually paying close attention to how much investment is being put into those systems. What we're going to see in 2015 is realisation of value on those core system investments by using them as operating platforms for innovations. Key considerations is don't just think about how organisations how effective the core platforms are. Also think about how effective their innovation is and how willing they are to open up those platforms to the innovators. How willing they are to collaborate by using the API economy. So if you've got someone who's got a wonderful core system, but they are keeping it entirely closed and not willing to let business partners access it, they're perhaps going to achieve a lot less than an organisation that is willing that has a less effective core system, but is more open to taking risks with their business intellectual property by opening it up. If I jump to second last one, amplified intelligence. We have invested over many decades in automating our businesses. There is only so far that process automation is able to go. One of the reasons why we haven't seen the huge drop in employment that we predicted in the 1970s due to automation is that a lot of people who were previously doing clerical functions are now dedicated to exception management. A significant number of processes don't run from start to finish. In fact, in best case, processes typically can't do better than 60% efficiency, where from the start of the process to the end of the process, it runs through without an exception being thrown. That means somebody provisioning a mortgage, somebody buying a product from a retailer, or in business to business, somebody arranging a service to be delivered. at least 40% of the time, something goes wrong. Something runs as an exception that a human being needs to intervene. What we're seeing with cognitive analytics is this is the sweet spot for it to learn what a human does when they have to intervene in a process. So when that utility bill doesn't match up to the consumer's expectations, isn't exactly the number they expected, the meter reading wasn't what they expected, when the mortgage documents aren't in the form that the process expected them to be, what the machine learns over thousands of iterations what the human did and is actually able to intervene on behalf of the human. Considerations in this is to set priorities, and the priority are to focus on process exceptions and to identify those process exceptions where there are lots of instances and we can have machines learn, where we can actually get machines to intervene and to make it feel seamless for the user of the process. We do expect resistance, not least of which because we are actually here threatening jobs. People who've been crafting responses to those exceptions are going to be resistant to allowing the machines to take that over. However, there are new roles for those people to take on, and that's the key for innovative companies, because there are new value adds which can be found. And the most successful companies won't look at this as an opportunity to get rid of jobs. They'll look at this as an opportunity to actually free people up to do more creative things. Finally, one of those most creative things that we have in our organisations is the IT worker. And we use that in the most generic sense. The legacy workforce is retiring. Those people, the generations who worked end-to-end on big systems, but our businesses are having to maintain those big systems and then build on them as platforms of innovation. The number of graduates coming out of university with skills to meet these needs has plateaued. At least the drop has been arrested, but certainly we haven't seen the growth that would be easily justified by the volume of need that organisations have. One response was to outsource and offshore. Offshoring and multi-shoring has a role, but it only goes so far. And in fact, what people found was that if you take too much offshore, you lose innovation, you lose the ability to interact directly with the users of the technology, and organisations lose agility. For that reason, many companies have actually not only reduced their rate of offshoring, they've reversed it. So while the quantity of offshore jobs has increased, that actually reflects the increase in the total amount of technology-related work that's happening, not the percentage of work that's happening. So key consideration is actually to think about who the leaders of tomorrow are going to be and to make sure they have a full career path within the organisation. To treat technology differently and to hire differently, and not to hire simply from traditional sources, and to be willing to cross-train and to get people excited. To be willing to embrace virtual working, to allow knowledge workers to work from wherever they are in far more creative ways, rather than forcing them to fit into the straitjackets of a 9-to-5 office environment in one location. To embrace the open talent economy, outside in, and to allow people who are employees of a company, partners of a company, and potentially working at multiple companies, including, by the way, to enable you to achieve the goals of the API business that I talked about before. And fundamentally, to challenge some of the tenets that we've had of HR over decades gone by. So I'll stop there for a moment. I will finish after I open up the questions by talking about some of the things that are coming over the line in terms of quantum computing, cybersecurity, and implications on biology. But I'd like to pause for maybe 5-10 minutes of questions before I go on to the exponentials, if I could.
So people on the telephone, now's the chance. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, may I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
Okay, yeah, sure. I wasn't sure if you could hear me or not. I'm not sure if I took it off mute. That's okay. So you mentioned in regards to, just on the cognitive and artificial intelligence point, that there are a significant number of processes that don't, well, there's like at least 40% of the time something goes wrong. I guess we're sort of seeing more and more examples where sort of smart artificial intelligence, super intelligent machines kind of outperform humans. So, I mean, what is your response to that? Or
You're quite right. We are seeing more examples where companies are bringing to market computers that are able to do tasks that we would just simply say that has to be done by a human being. What's interesting is what's more important than what's happening is how it's happening. So this is the second of 3 waves of artificial intelligence. The first wave of artificial intelligence through the 70s and 80s was focused on trying to mimic the decision-making processes of human beings. And what that did was it encoded every single decision that a human made, and then the computer followed a pathway down. It was a decision tree type of model. Now that technology became essential for our knowledge systems today. So that technology enabled us to have storefront systems that was able to answer a huge variety of questions. Call centers where a call center operator could answer complex questions about technical topics, quickly navigating to the right answer, and enabled us to build web systems that were also better able to anticipate. And we call those today knowledge systems. The second generation started with big data in the noughties and became analytics around big data. That was really enabled by the internet, creating large volumes of data that we could get access to. And what those companies releasing those systems have found is that they could apply analytic techniques to those large volumes of largely internet residing data to see patterns. That's very much the way search engines work. Now, what that can do is it can say if 1,000 people have tried to answer a particular question, then I will see then I can find out what the average answer is. I can look at things like how close that answer was to the outcome that the questioner was looking for, and I can tailor it, even if the way that the question is asked is perhaps a little bit different each time. You're seeing this in tools like Apple Siri. That's exactly the way those tools work. They don't have pre-programmed the answer to every question. They've looked at every single time somebody's asked what sort of answer was the most appropriate to give, including how they asked and what sort of language they used. The boundary, the limit to this technology is the cognitive leap. So what a human can do that this form of artificial intelligence can't do is make the leap to join 2 completely unrelated things together that have never been joined together. It's almost the artistic element. It can mimic the artistic element, but all it's doing is taking the accumulated examples that others have given and simulating that artistic element.
It's the unpredictability of humans that computers still can't anticipate.
That's correct. Yeah. Now, the reason why I talk about the second of 3 waves is that there's a lot of research going on, and this is one of the exponentials I was going to talk about, to the 3rd wave of artificial intelligence, which is to attempt to actually tackle the unpredictability of humans. Right. And to try and find ways of making cognitive leaps and then testing whether those cognitive leaps are useful.
There's the 4th wave, the Terminator.
we do make reference in the report. We do make reference in the report to the singularity.
Right.
And whether we have our Terminator moment, which is over the horizon. And in all seriousness, you've seen debates in the you've seen important debate in the media for the first time about whether or not we should be having this debate.
Well, Elon Musk and Bill Gates and others all suddenly concerned.
Suddenly there are a lot of very eminent thinkers who are worrying about whether or not artificial intelligence, the 3rd wave of artificial intelligence, takes us to a very uncomfortable place. And I think from a societal perspective, it is really important that we have that debate, and the answers are not clear. Yeah. Other questions?
Bulgarian here. Bulgarian here. I've got a question, Rob. I figure if someone's phone, I just barge in with a question. It's going to be easiest business.
Please.
This one is a little less exciting than the singularity, but for opening up and this revitalisation of core ERP systems, do you have any thoughts on where the market amongst vendors sits there with perhaps the rise of more flexible players like NetSuite and the potential demise of some of the bigger, older players, I mean the SAPs and the Oracles and so on?
So I think we are very excited in looking at the trends in the rise of a number of innovative players, and you mentioned one, and we can mention half a dozen that have appeared. And one of the reasons why this is exciting is we saw the consolidation of the big ERP players. We saw a wave of consolidation really into two massive players, and there was a debate and there was a concern that the market was too concentrated. We predicted some time ago that innovation would naturally mean that other players would rise, and that cloud would be a trigger for that. I would be very careful about predicting any demise of the major players. Quite the opposite. They have an enormous amount of intellectual property, they have an enormous installed base, and they have an enormous capability to innovate, and they have very strong balance sheets, which means they have an enormous ability to acquire some of the innovations that's happening. So I think this is actually a good news story this year. I think that for those people who are invested in the major players, they are looking particularly solid, and they have very interesting technologies appearing. However, they are also opening up, and the ecosystem around them of innovation is more exciting than it has been for a number of years. At the same time, for those that are looking for a competitive marketplace, it's particularly exciting because we're seeing a rise of vendors who are taking the fight right up to the big two players and bringing innovative products largely to middle markets, but we're seeing it grow very, very rapidly to top end of town and to big governments. And I think as somebody who watches the market, that's a really exciting trend.
Thanks for that, Robert.
I might, if there's no other questions now, I'll jump on.
Are there any more questions? Any more questions there on the telephone?
I'll jump to the exponentials because there's a few that I want to call out. I'm going to go out of order to what's on the screen here. I'm going to talk first of all about quantum computing because it leads into several of the others. 2015 is a really important year for quantum computing because a number of important debates will happen, and we'll watch the technology very, very closely. There are two schools of thought. One school of thought says that quantum computing is here now in a very, very limited and specialised form, and will simply expand to a more general form. Another school of thought says that there are some fundamental limitations and the technology won't appear in the form that's been suggested. This is not an academic or intellectual debate because one of the capabilities of quantum computing is the calculation of factorials, very quick calculation of factorials, which enables the immediate cracking of the foundation of our security. At the same time in 2015, governments and business around the world are debating how much we put onto the internet and we allow electronically. Let me give you one important example, electronic voting. Today the technology exists for governments around the world to enable electronic voting to occur. The technology to encrypt electronic voting, the default technology to encrypt electronic voting relies upon the factoring of very large numbers on the basis that is not able to be cracked. Imagine a world where we open up electronic voting and somebody stores large numbers of those votes in their secure form, and then in decades to come somebody else invents technology such as quantum computing that allows that to be cracked, so that you can go all the way back to 2015 or 2016 and find out what somebody voted, potentially within their lifetime. There is no evidence that there's insufficient evidence that this will definitely happen, but there is insufficient evidence that this won't happen. While there's a material chance that it won't happen, governments and business need to be very concerned about whether anything that they're encrypting is of concern if it is decrypted in the distant future. And certainly electronic voting is one of the best examples that we have of that. So what I highlight with quantum computing is that's a particularly important technology to watch, not just because it provides a gateway to some exciting advances in the future, but also because it may limit or constrain how we work. By the way, what we also call out from a cybersecurity perspective is uncrackable, mathematically uncrackable encryption for things like voting is entirely possible, but more expensive. If we consider this to be material risk, we simply go to that form of technology. I've already talked about artificial intelligence. Let me touch now on additive manufacturing. Additive manufacturing is really the extension of 3D printing. The most important thing I want to call out is previously commentators talked about 3D printing as a consumer trend and that everybody would have a 3D printer in their home. That is not where we see it going. What we see happening is that 3D printing is a business trend. It is a technique that ranges from allowing small volume prototyping to on-site development, close to need development of parts, through to technologies that will become high volume and highly efficient for manufacturing processes. And 2015 is seeing dramatic increase in the capability of the printers, specialization in the manufacturing processes, and a dramatic broadening in the range of materials that can be used in those manufacturing processes. But these are largely not a 2015 trend. They'll be pioneered this year and then develop out in future years. This year we called out cybersecurity as being so important that every one of the trends we actually put a cyber implication in. We think cyber is so central to organisations that we think that every conversation should include a discussion on what the cyber implication is, to determine whether or not it matters if, and perhaps rather than if I should say when, an intruder manages to hack part or all of the technology. We've moved past a world where we can completely close things off. We've moved down to a risk management world, as many organisations have discovered, unfortunately. If I move back well and truly into the realm of the far future, industrial biology, we are seeing medicine. The Internet of Things was a trend that we talked about over a number of years, which really has been about the convergence of engineering technology with information technology, which has broadened out the range of people who interact with technology dramatically.